Welcome everyone. So on behalf of the Committee for the Free Speech Movement Educational Program, I welcome you all. So today's program is, we have a forum on Syria. As you know, there's a lot happening in Syria today. Before I do get into that, however, I would like to introduce the members of the committee. I am the current chair for the couple of months. And we have Steve Mendoza in the back over there, and Virginia Shee. We also have a couple of members who are not here today, John Ceballos, as well as Linda Norton. So we do programs like these anywhere between 3 to 6 programs a year, usually during the fall and the spring semesters. So I welcome you all, and I hope you had a chance to have some foods and drinks. All right, so today's program, we have 2 speakers, and we're hoping to open it up for lively debate, I hope. It's a forum in Syria, and our first speaker is going to be Fred, alphabetical. So Fred, I've actually known Fred for quite a few years now. We meet often at the Middle East Studies Association, and we say hello. And sometimes I meet him here on campus when he's doing research. So, and now my daughter is one of his students, so I know him even better. So Professor Fred Lawson currently teaches at Mills College. He's the head of the government department, and he teaches a lot of international relations courses. And he is his latest book is Global Security Watch, Syria. It was published in 2013. He's also been the past president of the Syrian Studies Association. Fred received his BA from Indiana University. I don't know what year, it was not on his website. And he has an MA and PhD from UCLA. Again, no time, so it could have been yesterday as far as I know. Huh? All right, and Christian is my other friend. I also know him through Middle East Studies Association. He is the current president of the Kurdish Studies Association, as well as the associate director of the Center for Middle Eastern and African...
Middle Eastern Studies.
Middle Eastern Studies, yes. And his latest article is Media Freedoms and Covert Diplomacy. Turkey Challenges Europe Over Kurdish Broadcasts. It was published in Global Media and Communication in December 2014. So now I would like you to welcome both of our speakers. Fred first.
We stand halfway through the 4th long year of the Syrian civil war. It's almost impossible to believe that the war has dragged on as long as it has. Now that we're halfway through the 4th year of the war, there are 3 aspects of this brutal conflict that seem agonizingly unchanged. We're still pretty much in the same place that we were 2 years ago, 3 years ago. In the first place, the external leadership of the opposition seems to be incapable of acting in a unified way, and is certainly incapable of acting in any kind of effective way. The primary body of the external leadership calls itself the Syrian National Coalition of Revolutionary and Opposition Forces, the Syrian National Coalition. And the Syrian National Coalition still has no coherent plan for a post-Ba'athi political order. We have no idea what the Syrian National Coalition has in mind, no idea what might happen if Bashar al-Assad would resign tomorrow. The paralysis inside the Syrian National Coalition probably reflects intense rivalry between the coalition's 2 primary sponsors. Most of the forces inside the coalition are either sponsored by Saudi Arabia or they are sponsored by Qatar. And Saudi Arabia and Qatar have been jockeying with one another for control over the organization. Some of the disunity no doubt reflects that jockeying. The disunity also reflects long-time friction between broadly secular civil rights activists who are part of the coalition and the large contingent of Muslim brothers who have been part of the national coalition from the very beginning. And those two forces do not work very well together either. The simmering disputes seem endless inside the Syrian National Coalition. I note that a couple of weeks ago, the disputes inside the National Coalition prevented the body from electing a new prime minister. There was so much disagreement that no one has been elected to be the next prime minister of the interim government, of the government in exile, sponsored by the Syrian National Coalition. The second constant that we have in the conflict is that the war has taken a marked ethno-sectarian character. The fighting really has broken down along religious lines. It has broken down around linguistic lines. Various ascriptive groups are driving the conflict at the moment. Not only are there Shi'i militias and Druze militias and Alawi militias, but over the last few months, various communities of Christians have also organized separate militias to protect their villages, to protect their neighborhoods. And many of these militias, formed by Chaldean Christians and Syriac Christians, Greek Orthodox, are located up in the northern and eastern part of Syria. Some of these new Christian coalitions appear to be coordinating their activities with the pro-regime force called the National Defense Force. So many elements of the opposition charge that the new Christian militias are in fact working hand in hand with the regime. And as we will hear, as I'm excited to hear in just a few minutes, the Kurdish inhabitants of Syria's northeastern province have also mobilized into militias, mobilized into fighting forces as well. The third constant that we see in the conflict, even after all these years, is that anti-regime forces in Syria seem to be more intensely engaged in fighting against one another than they are in fighting against government troops. The extent of the antagonism that we see among different anti-regime forces is clearly evident in the constantly shifting kaleidoscope of opposition alliances. We really do need a scorecard these days to keep track of which militia is aligned with which, of which militia has turned against some of the other opposition forces. As recently as December 2013, a new broad coalition of opposition militias took shape, called itself the Islamic Front. The Islamic Front on paper was a very impressive group of militias. It included the battalions of the Free of Syria, one of the largest and best equipped of the anti-regime militias. It included the Hawks of Syria, a small but very well-armed and well-organized militia in the northwest part of the country. It included the Army of Islam, the Unity Brigade, the Truth Brigade, a very large, relatively coherent body, the Islamic Front. A month after it formed, in January 2014, the Islamic Front launched a coordinated offensive, but it did not launch an offensive against government armed forces. Instead, the Islamic Front attacked one of the Al-Qaeda-linked militias in Aleppo, the Assistance Front for the People of Syria. So instead of attacking government armed forces, this opposition group immediately turned its guns on one of the other opposition forces. A couple of months ago, the Islamic Front seems to be breaking down. The Army of Islam announced that it was going to break away from the battalions of the Free and joined a tactical alliance with a group up in the northwest part of the country called the Syrian Revolutionaries Front. So it looks like, what are we, 8 months in, that the Islamic Front has also broken apart, fallen into feuding with different constituent parts, skirmishing against one another. This has been happening for the last 4 years. This is one of the primary reasons why the war seems to drag on without going anywhere. The one thing that does seem different to me as we go through the 4th year of the uprising is the emergence of 4 sharply distinct theaters of battle. I think it now makes sense to think of the Syrian civil war not as one thing, but as 4 different conflicts taking place almost simultaneously. The first theater of the civil war is taking place in the far northeastern part of the country, along the border with Iraq, along the border with Turkey. It includes the large and important cities of Raqqa in the middle part of the country, Hasaki up in the north, east, and Deir ez-Zor on the border on the way to Iraq. The second theater of the civil war consists of the south-central part of Syria, the area broadly between Damascus and Homs, and it includes the strategically important border districts between Syria and Lebanon. A third very different theater of the battle at the moment is taking place in the northwestern part of the country, the sparsely populated hill country of the northwest, broadly everything north of Hama and west of the city of Aleppo. And just as we speak, a fourth theater of the civil war seems to be taking shape along the border on the southernmost fringe of Syria, on the border with Jordan, with Israel, and with the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. From 30,000 feet, looking at this conflict, scholars have claimed that the civil war has settled down into a stalemate, that everything has kind of come to a halt, that things have settled in. But I think it's quite useful to lay out the dynamics of these 4 different theaters to see whether or not conflicts in these 4 areas have somehow washed out so that the 30,000-foot view is in fact misleading. So let me say just a few words about each of these different theaters of the conflict, and then we will go from there when there are questions. I'll say just a few words about the northeastern theater of the Syrian civil war, because we have someone to really tell us what's actually going on in this part of the country. The northeastern theater of the civil war right at the moment is certainly receiving the most attention. This is what all the newspapers are telling us about. This is what the evening news is telling us about. And these northeastern provinces, the provinces of Raqqa and Hasaki and Deir ez-Zor, are fully engulfed in large-scale warfare. There's real conflict, real shooting going on in this part of the country. The conflict involves 3 powerful political forces. First, up in the northeast part of the country, is a well-armed, well-organized Kurdish movement. The Kurdish movement associated with the political organization, the Democratic Union Party. Again, we're looking forward to hearing much more about this in just a minute. The Kurdish national movement is fighting up in the northeast part of the country against 2 competing Islamist formations. It's a 3-way conflict up in the northeast. One of the Islamist formations in this part of the country is the Assistance Front for the People of Syria, the group that the United States press insists on using an Arabic name for, Jabhat al-Nusra, but in fact we could call it the Assistance Front, just for short, just to make it seem a bit more intelligible. And the Assistance Front is struggling not only against the Kurds, but the Assistance Front is also fighting against the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. I trust some of you at least saw the Frontline documentary last night on KQED, The Rise of ISIS. And if you haven't, please do look it up and stream it through streaming, because it's really quite well done. Up in the northeast part of the country, the Kurdish force, the Democratic Union Party, dominates the cities, we'll see if I'm right about this in just a second, but dominates the cities of Al-Hasaki and Al-Qamishli up in the northeast part of the country, and the Kurdish forces continue to hold several important oil-producing districts up in the northeast. The Islamic State, by contrast, exercises firm control over the central city of Raqqa. The Islamic State launched a large-scale offensive against the Assistance Front in the northeast in the spring of this year. In April and May of 2014, the Islamic State attacked Assistance Front positions in and around the town of Deir ez-Zor, and at first the Islamic State was pushed back from Deir ez-Zor, but in early May of this year, the Islamic State gained the upper hand, struck south toward Abu Kamal on the border with Iraq, and then rolled into northern Iraq in late May and early June. Beginning in the summer of this year, the Islamic State turned back. My impression of the Islamic State is that it's a quite mobile military force. It pushes as far as it can go in one direction, and as soon as it gets blocked, the fighters turn around and go the other way. So as soon as the offensive stalled in Iraq, the Islamic State turned back toward Syria, marched back through the northeast, and since the summer of this year, the Islamic State has engaged Kurdish forces in battle over a string of towns along the border with Turkey. All of these important strategically located border crossings between Syria and Turkey. The Islamic State was driven out of the largest of these border crossings at Azaz, but the Islamic State continues to be entrenched in Jarablus and in Tel al-Abyad, two of the major highways between northeast Syria and Turkey. As we know, since the middle of September, outside parties have gotten involved in this theater of battle. French aircraft, United States aircraft, Saudi aircraft, United Emirates forces have been deeply involved in the fighting in the northeastern theater of the country beginning in mid-September. At the same time that the fighting has been raging across the northeastern provinces of Syria, the Syrian armed forces, the government forces, have steadily re-established government control over districts around Damascus and now around Homs. This government campaign took shape as early as June of 2013. In June of 2013, Syrian troops joined with fighters of the Lebanese Islamist movement, the Party of God, Hezbollah, to capture the border town of Al-Qusayr, an important transit point between northern Lebanon and central Syria. And as soon as government forces reoccupied the town at Al-Qusayr, pro-regime forces moved on into the north in the direction of Yabrud and captured Yabrud in mid-March of 2014, in February of 2014. Government forces have then continued the campaign to reestablish central control over areas along the Lebanese border up in the direction of Homs. Meanwhile, in the very last weeks of 2013, local ceasefires broke out in a number of districts around Damascus, a number of districts around Homs, where local opposition fighters would reach an arrangement with state military officers to put down their arms for a limited period of time, to give the population a rest, to allow supplies to move back and forth. Many of these ceasefires took the character of a kind of celebration. And we have pictures, we have some evidence that when the fighters finally agreed to stop shooting at each other, government forces would shake hands with opposition militia people, the two would greet one another, and so on. As you could imagine, this kind of activity made the external leadership in the Syrian National Coalition crazy. The external leadership went ballistic over these pictures of opposition fighters hugging local troops and so on after these ceasefires got implemented. The most important of these truces was carried out, in early February of this year at the city of Homs, the important city of Homs in the center part of the country. And the truce between opposition fighters and the government in Homs set the stage for all of the opposition militias to pull out of the city in early May. And government troops reoccupied Homs, took positions in the central city of Homs that had been out of government control ever since the spring of 2011. In the spring of this year, Syria's armed forces have carried out sustained military operations in the suburbs of Damascus, areas of Damascus that have been under opposition control for 2 or 3 years. In mid-September, about a month ago, two major opposition centers fell to government troops. First, the suburb of Adra, and then the provincial administrative center of Duma have been reoccupied by government forces. So we see that the Syrian authorities have regained momentum. The Syrian authorities have re-established central control in a largish part of the country, which is a new development, I think, in this fourth year. One quick thing to say about the south central part of the country: the steady reconsolidation of the regime's hold in the south central part of the country seems to have sparked the rise of several radical cells. There are reports that militants who have been completely upset by the government's success in the battlefield have started to resort to bombings and assassinations in and around the capital. There's the appearance of a new group that calls itself Al-Ansar, and Al-Ansar is carrying out particularly brutal and unpredictable attacks against government installations, perhaps as a kind of desperate measure, seeing that the opposition is losing some of its position down in the south. Third, what's going on up in the northwest? Up in the northwest, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant pulled out of the countryside around Hama in January of 2014. One of the big pieces of news as the fourth year of the uprising begins is that the Islamic State withdrew from the area west of Aleppo, north of Homs. By March of 2014, Islamic State fighters had also pulled out of the area around Latakia on the coast and the area of Idlib down just a little bit south from Aleppo. As soon as the Islamic State fighters pulled out of the northwest, the assistance front moved into this part of the country in force and launched a combined assault on the Christian border town of Keseb, which is not on the map, but is on the Turkish border right there on the coast of the Mediterranean. The assistance front occupied the town of Keseb and then moved into adjacent areas, moved into the villages of the hill country along the Mediterranean coast. And it was not until mid-June that the assistance front forces in this part of the country were broken up and pushed back. By July of this year, the Islamic Front seems to be falling apart, and the Islamic Front, that was the major opposition group in the northwest part of the country, appears to be disintegrating. As the Islamic Front disintegrates, one of its component parts has seized the initiative, has started to set the agenda in this part of the country. The group called the Syrian Revolutionaries Front is the group we should probably look for, read between the lines, and try to find in reporting in the northwest part of the country. The Obama administration consistently calls the Syrian Revolutionaries Front a moderate opposition, which I think is a really tricky claim to make. The Syrian Revolutionaries Front doesn't seem particularly moderate in any meaningful way, but certainly the Syrian Revolutionaries Front has been fighting against the Assistance Front, has been fighting against the Al-Qaeda radicals up in the northwest part of the country. And the Syrian Revolutionaries Front in mid-August of this year ordered the Assistance Front to leave the area, ordered the Assistance Front to evacuate the northwest and leave the northwest to groups that are somewhat connected to the Free Syrian Army. All across the northwest part of the country, the regime continues to have control of the major cities. So the various urban centers are still under government control, and it's the countryside, it's the villages out around the cities where the opposition is active at the moment. Just a couple of days ago, on the 27th of October, fighters from the Assistance Front, more or less out of the clear blue sky, launched a large-scale attack on the city of Idlib. and it's been a little hard to figure out what's going on here from halfway around the world, but fighters from the assistance front seem to have gotten into the center of town in Idlib, seem to have gotten all the way to the governor's office, all the way to the central police station, occupied the governor's office, trashed it a little bit before being pushed out of the city. So the assistance front has lost some of its hold in the northwest part of the country, but again, as a last thrash, as the death throes perhaps of the assistance front's activity in the northwest, remains a dangerous actor. Finally, let me say just a couple of words about this far south, because the far south has been barely talked about over the last 4 years. We almost hear nothing. It seems like the Southern Front has been quite quiet over the last 4 years. There were sporadic firefights along the border. There were some artillery shells that went back and forth into Lebanon, back and forth into the Golan. But for the most part, this part of the country managed to stay out of the fighting until just about now. Beginning in October and November of 2013, it's the assistance front that stepped up its activities in the southern part of the country. So the assistance front that has lost ground in other parts of the country, the assistance front has gained some momentum down in the southern province of Daraa, along the border with Jordan. And as the assistance front has become active down in the south, the assistance front has carried out raids against villages along the border between Daraa province and Aswada province. And assistance front fighters have been kidnapping Christians and kidnapping Druze down in the south, holding them for ransom, partly for monetary ransom to finance the group's operations, but also holding these Christians and Druze hostage and negotiating with the regime to release imprisoned comrades of the assistance front. As a result of the activities of the assistance front down in the south, the Druze community in Syria has finally shaken itself and awakened. And the Druze community down in the south has finally mobilized to protect itself the way that the Kurdish community in the northeast has mobilized to protect itself. The assistance front then, finding itself confronted by an awakened Druze community, the assistance front just in the last few weeks has turned its attention to government positions along the Golan front. Members of the assistance front have advanced into Al-Quneitra along the occupied Golan, and the battle for Al-Quneitra has spilled across the border into the Golan. The Israelis at the moment are extraordinarily exercised about the fighting that's taking place along the Golan. The Israelis are particularly worried that this will represent a flashpoint, a way in which the Syrian civil war will finally pose a direct threat to the state of Israel. The assistance front seems to be gaining some momentum down in the south, but as it gains strength in the south, the assistance front has alienated units of the Free Syrian Army down in the south. And as we read the newspapers over the next few weeks, we need to pay attention to whether or not these elements of the Free Syrian Army, where the United States administration is pinned a lot of hopes, has put a lot of effort into training and arming Free Syrian Army units based inside Jordan along the southern front, whether conflict might well erupt between those Free Syrian Army units and the assistance front. From 30,000 feet, the war seems to be a stalemate. It seems like the war just drags on and nothing much interesting happens. But in different sectors of the fighting, in these three different theaters, there are trends that we should well pay attention to. Thanks. Sorry, ate into your time.
Thank you, Fred. I think that served as a background for what I'm going to talk about. Fred mentioned that this conflict has really become very ethno-sectarian in nature. a very complicated jigsaw puzzle of different linguistic groups, different religious groups and such. And tonight I'm going to focus on just one of those groups, and that's the Kurds. Back in the summer of 2011, a friend of mine and I decided to write an article on Kurdish politics in Syria, the evolution of Kurdish politics in Syria. And back then, no one had heard of Kurds in Syria. No one knew anything about the politics of what was going on there. And now, turn on the radio, you turn on the TV, all you hear about is the Kurds in Syria, a group completely unknown to the global public just 3 years ago. So I think it's important to understand who these people are today by looking at their past. How has Syria, as the Syrian Arab Republic, really shaped who these people are? So we're going to look at who these people are, not just in Syria, but regionally speaking. Before 2011, and 2011 is a turning point because that's when the uprising started, and at that point it was an uprising. It became a civil war probably sometime in the summer of 2012. And we'll look at the Kurds up in the northern regions of the country during that time, and then present day, summer 2014 up until now, because Kobanê is really what's in the news now, what's happening, and we'll look at it, right up until what's happening this afternoon. Also then the regional implications. Fred mentioned Jordan, Israel, Lebanon. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the north and the northeast, Turkey and Iraq, because this conflict certainly does have regional implications, also implications for the US. So unfortunately, there are a lot of groups, their names, they're all these three-letter acronyms that appear in print, on the radio. I'm going to try to use the full name, but if I do say SNC or KNC or KRG, this is what I'm talking about. Mentioned in the first half of the talk was the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, the SNC, the Syrian National Council. Fred mentioned the PYD, used the English name, the Democratic Union Party. I'll just call it a Kurdish political party in Syria for simplicity's sake. The PKK, the KRG is the Kurdish regional government in northern Iraq. The KNC is the Kurdish National Council, a group of Kurdish political parties that got together a couple years ago. I wish I had a handout to give you with all these names so you could follow along, but didn't want to mention them. Okay, so the Kurds are scattered pretty much all over Syria, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. In this map, you can see that most of the green space is in Turkey. The areas that are green overlap into Syria. And if you just look at a map of Syria and where the borders are, you'll see that there are three pretty much non-contiguous areas. But if you go back to the main map, they do connect with the larger Kurdish nation. So in Syria itself, you have these pockets of populations that are not connected to each other within Syria, but are connected to Kurds in the region, figuratively speaking, because the borders do not allow them to connect. So in Syria, they are the largest ethnic minority, making up about 9 to 10% of the population there. They speak Kurdish. This is a language not related to Arabic, not related to Turkish. It's Indo-European, in fact, more closely related to Persian. The closest language in the region related to Kurdish is actually Baluchi, spoken in southern Iran and the border area with Pakistan. They've had very limited rights and freedoms living in the Syrian Arab Republic. The constitution in Syria gave rights to its Arab citizens. The language that was deemed the official and singular language of the country was Arabic. So in the 60s, what was decided right before the Ba'ath Party came to power was to hold a census to see who was Arab, who was Kurdish, who should have citizenship, and who shouldn't. So this took place in the northeast, in the province of Hasake. Kurds there were given 24 hours, 36 hours, just a couple days maybe, to gather documents to prove they had been living there for, or since 1945. If you couldn't prove that you had been living in the country since 1945, your citizenship was revoked. Kurds were already second-class citizens in the country. This then created a whole new class of residents, not even citizens, because these Kurds now without citizenship had no right to work in the public sector, no right to attend state university. Rights were completely removed. Many of them left. They tried to leave, except if you're not a citizen, you don't have the right to a passport. So they had to be smuggled out of the country, or they had to try to escape somehow from Syria. They weren't allowed to marry a Syrian citizen because without citizenship, you were only able to marry someone from that same category. Most of the Kurds, we saw on the map before, live in the north part, but not just the northeast, also in the northwest, north of Aleppo in that corner, and also right where Kobanê is. In Kurdish, they call this region Rojava, which literally means west. If you look at the larger picture of the Kurdish areas, the Kurds divide this up into 4 areas and have a name in Kurdish, directional points. So Syria is West Kurdistan, Turkey is North Kurdistan, Iraq is South Kurdistan, Iran is East Kurdistan. So the name Rojava in Kurdish simply means west, but it's also used to refer to this part of Greater Kurdistan. There were many Arabization policies in effect. What the government tried to do, particularly along the border with Turkey, was remove the Kurdish populations from those areas, resettle Arabs, to dilute the ethnic composition of the area. This was called the Arab Belt. And 10 to 15 kilometers along the border was resettled. This was in 74, 75. Other policies were to prohibit language use. During the union with Egypt, the United Arab Republic, from 58 to 61, Egypt sent in teachers. These were primary school teachers, middle school teachers, sent them to the Kurdish regions to ensure that everyone there learned Arabic and not Kurdish. You could be arrested for expressing your Kurdish identity, jailed for singing a Kurdish song, celebrating a Kurdish holiday. It was completely against the law. And I think this cafe is a very good place to be holding this sort of discussion. Free speech movement, they certainly did not have free speech there. Things have changed dramatically since that time, since 2011, when the revolution started. Now this general revolution has sparked many mini revolutions, and one is the Rojava Revolution, or the revolution of Western Kurdistan, Syrian Kurdistan. In the summer of 2012, right as the civil war was gaining ground, the regime troops withdrew from large parts of the areas in the Kurdish parts of Syria. The FSA, the Free Syrian Army, moved in kind of to take over and fill that vacuum. What happened then was, it was the Kurdish forces pitted against the FSA. In July of 2012, they started to retake some of these areas. And you'll see different sources say that in July of 2012, Kurds captured these cities, Kurds recaptured the cities, Kurds seized the cities, right? Depending on your point of view, different verbs are used. I'm just going to say Kurds secured these areas. I think that's the most neutral term I can use. Kobanê, the one city that was recaptured in this time, secured in this time, is a Kurdish majority city, although there are Armenians and others who live there. It is Kurdish majority. When certain papers refer to it as being seized, it's seized from the Free Syrian Army, who had been in there in the vacuum. There are 3 cantons. These are areas of Kurdish populations within the country that have declared semi-autonomous rule within the country. These are Afrin, Kobanê, and Jazire. And if you look at this map, you can see the far right, the Jazira province in Syria, and that spelling is a Kurdish spelling. The capital of that region is now Qamishlu, al-Qamishli in Arabic. Kobanê in the middle, the capital city is Kobanê, and Afrin in the northwest, the capital city is Afrin. So these are three non-contiguous areas in Syria that have declared autonomy. Each region has an elected head, and then they have a council, and then one person who is head of these three councils. They've developed their own constitution, and as a break from the repressive restrictions of the Syrian and Turkish constitutions. I told you a little bit about what the Syrian constitution said. Very similar in its scope is the Turkish constitution, which was written in 1982 in the wake of one of the military coups in Turkey. So, and of course, any constitution written by a military junta is not going to give you the kind of freedom of speech that you would expect in a multi-ethnic society. So in Turkey as well, one language was the law, and Kurds did not have the freedom of expression, their language, music, culture, or anything like that. A lot of parallels between Turkey and Syria. Slowly in Turkey, things are improving, and the Kurds are watching literally from across the border in Syria, seeing what was happening in Turkey as the AKP, the current ruling party in Turkey, gave Kurds more rights with television shows, the ability to teach Kurdish in private schools. And I think some of what was happening some of what started to happen in Syria perhaps was precipitated by the movement in Turkey, the Kurdish opening that they called it. Things now have progressed far more quickly in Syria. Kurds in the areas, the three cantons in Syria, have far more rights than those living elsewhere, even though they're in a country faced with a very complicated civil war with, dozens and dozens of different factions and the threat of the Islamic State taking over and wiping out the entire city of Kobanê. So some of the things that they've included in their constitution are pursuit of freedom, justice, dignity, and democracy, mutual and peaceful coexistence and understanding between all strands of society, and a little token nod to multilingualism. Official languages are Kurdish, Arabic, and Syriac, or sometimes called Suryani. And all communities have the right to teach and be taught in their native language. Since the regime removed the forces from these areas in Syria, Kurds have gathered together in the community to start schools, to teach in Kurdish. They now offer full mother tongue education in these areas, and that's reflected now in this constitution. Of course, the constitution doesn't have any international legal weight, but it is a basis for how they're trying to rebuild the society in these Kurdish areas of the country. This really scares Turkey because you have further to the east the semi-autonomous region of Kurdistan, South Kurdistan as some call it, that has had autonomy since the early 90s, officially since 2004, and potentially independence in the next couple of years. We don't know. So now we have the same thing happening in Syrian Kurdistan, in Rojava. So, of course, the regional implications can't be ignored. So what's now happening then with Kobanê? This is a town that sits literally on the border with Turkey. Attacks began on the canton of Kobanê in the summer. The ISIS forces or Islamic State forces moved in, started to capture village by village, getting closer, putting a stranglehold on Kobanê. By mid-September, 350 villages had been taken. There are only 354 villages in Kobanê. They had captured all but 4 of them. And the Kurds were completely surrounded on 3 sides by ISIS. On the 4th side is the border with Turkey. The border with Turkey was lined with mines, Turkish tanks. So there was pretty much no way out, but a small corridor was opened, and some 2,000 Kurds now have fled across the border. Early October, the Islamic State gained entrance to Kobanê, and there were pleas for airstrikes. Turkey was reluctant to participate at all. In fact, it refused permission of the United States to use Incirlik Air Force Base in Turkey, even though Turkey is a part of NATO. So the US and some Arab states started an air campaign, bombing some of the Islamic State positions around the Kobanê province. In, let's say the 29th, 9 days ago, they dropped weapons and supplies. These were organized by the KRG in South Kurdistan and dropped by US forces. It was a one drop, these giant crates with parachutes. Most of the supplies did reach the Kurdish forces there, the PYD militia, which is called the YPG. You might have also seen, just as a side note, written as YPJ. Well, YPJ is the People's Protection Units. YPJ is the Women's Protection Units. It's a special women's unit of fighters belonging to the PYD. So these were the groups that were supplied by the airdrop. That was October 20th. 1 or 2 of these crates landed outside the drop zone, and the Islamic State got a hold of them. So there was, it wasn't 100% successful, but it was very successful in helping the YPG push back the Islamic State. So here you can see some of the lines. Out here, this outer yellow line is from the summer, and slowly they started gaining and throughout the canton. And this final line here is from September 24th as they pushed in. And question that comes up often is, why? Why are they after this small town, a town of 40,000 people? The canton itself had a couple 100,000, but what is so important about this town? Well, they have, if you look at these black dots now, this is from early in 2014, those black dots were Islamic State strongholds. You can see they weren't present in many places. They used the rivers, so along the Euphrates River, they set up strongholds, and that was the main pathway for them to get from one area to the next. And if they captured Kobanê, they would have a straight line from west to east along the border. And why is the border important? Where are a lot of these supplies and the recruits coming from? Many say that they're coming across the border from Turkey, that Turkey is complicit in helping the Islamic State in its battle against the Kurds. There's a lot of tension between Turkey and the Kurds. The Turkish government saw the Islamic State as perhaps the best option in ousting Assad and his regime. They still insist that that's their goal, and everything that they do in terms of their foreign policy is with a lens on removing Assad from power. So when the US said they were going to start airstrikes, Turkey said, we're not going to help unless you agree to oust Assad. The US said, no, that's not what our goal is. Our goal really here is to help the Kurds liberate this town. They couldn't let this small town fall. Fear of opening up the border is also had become a symbolic turning point. If Kobanê fell, and we'll talk about this at the end, if Kobanê fell, the implications for what would happen to the Kurds in Turkey was astronomical. I mean, the blowback there would have been impossible to contain. So if you look here, early 2014, the Islamic State doesn't have a lot of presence, but slowly they have really covered that whole area and now completely surround Kobanê. All right, the Islamic State has overtaken all of these areas. Kobanê is completely isolated on all sides by the Islamic State, and on the north by the Turkish border. Here's a close-up map of October 20th when the airdrop took place. They were able to breach the city and take over much of the city with the weapons that were supplied by the airdrops. Much of the city has been retaken now. The Kurds have retaken the city. ISIS has been pushed out. And now what's happening today? There have been negotiations with the troops in Iraqi Kurdistan called the Pêşmerge. Now, what Turkey wanted was very different from what the US wanted, very different from what the Kurds in Syria wanted. So there's a lot of behind-the-scenes negotiations. The United States actually started direct talks for the first time with the PYD, which is the Kurdish political party in power. The PKK in Turkey formed across the border there in Turkey, now has a base in Iraq, in Kurdish Iraq, in Kandil. The PKK has been designated as a terrorist organization by Turkey, by NATO, by the United States. Turkey says that the PYD is an offshoot of the PKK, therefore it is also a terrorist organization. The current president, past prime minister of Turkey, Recep Erdogan, says that he sees no difference whatsoever between the PYD, PKK, and the Islamic State. So they're all terrorist groups. So the United States then actually starting face-to-face negotiations with the PYD has really not done a lot to bolster Washington-Ankara relations. But on the other hand, Saleh Muslim, who's the head of the PYD, has been in Ankara, invited by Turkey to talk there. Ankara is conducting talks with the PKK. They send delegations to İmralı, the island out, off the coast of Istanbul, where the imprisoned leader of the PKK has been in jail since 1999. So it's very hypocritical for them to say that others cannot speak to these groups because they are terrorists in their mind. So of course then you have very different perspectives in South Kurdistan. You have two political parties there that are often at odds with one another. The KDP, which is the ruling party there, is run by the Barzani family. Many see him as someone who has too close of a relationship with Turkey. They wanted to send in their own forces. Turkey finally relented and said, okay, you can send the Pêşmerge, the South Kurdish forces, to Kobanê and actually going through Turkish territory. And this was huge. This was a huge breakthrough. And no one really knows exactly how the Turks eventually decided to allow it, but probably pressure from Washington or some future promises to do something. We don't know. This was the convoy today through Turkey of the anti-tank and other heavy weaponry that's been coming through. The actual troops were flown directly from the KRG region to a border town near Kobanê in Turkey. But of course they had to take the artillery, the heavy weapons overland. A lot of the troops who arrived by plane said they were harassed by the Turkish military there. They weren't given proper accommodations, nothing. And yet then the Kurds who were coming in overland received heroes' welcomes from the Kurds living in these border areas. Publicly, the PR for Ankara is not good on this. And the Kurds have won another PR coup when you see scenes like this in the streets. And one thing that has happened, when you see these scenes, this woman here hanging off the truck and others in the streets, they are flying a flag from South Kurdistan. This is a flag that, for some in Turkey, is seen as a sign of treason because of the animosity towards some of the ruling family there. They have their own flag. It's three colors of the Kurdish colors. See the bar across the top, the red, the yellow, and the green. This tricolor is their flag, or a flag with an upside-down triangle for the YPG. But now you're seeing this flag from Kurdistan being used in Turkey in events like this. We're seeing more and more unity amongst the different Kurdish groups, whether PYD, PKK, KRG. If you think back to the list of acronyms, you'll remember which groups I'm talking about. So here's a cartoon that appeared in the press there. In Arabic, on the zipper, it says Kobanê. Along the top rung of the zipper, Erbil, which is the capital of South Kurdistan or Iraqi Kurdistan, and then the bottom, Kandil, which is a mountainous area where the PKK has its headquarters. So Erbil and Kandil have always been very separate, very much at odds with each other. What's happening in Kobanê, this cartoon is saying, it's pulling them closer together. Right? We see these two axes coming much closer together, and then ISIS is being kicked out. So the very complex relationships amongst the Kurds are still complex, but there's been more accord, more unity in terms of what to do to confront the common enemy. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, the KRG parliament recognized these three cantons in Rojava, and they had been insistent for a long time that they would absolutely, under no circumstances, recognize the autonomy of these three cantons. So things are changing very quickly in the region. And then, you know, will there be Kurdish unity? It's something that's that we can probably imagine more today than just 2 years ago, 3 years ago. This Saturday is the National Global Kurdish Unity Day. There will be rallies and protests all around the globe, from Europe to South America to the Middle East, maybe here on campus, I don't know, for Kurdish unity. And you know, the other regional implications we talked about a little bit. The U.S. now coordinating with the PYD, that's the Kurdish political party in Syria. If Kobanê falls, what will be the fallout? Well, what has Turkey been doing to help the Kurds in Syria? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Comments that I've seen on Facebook saying that if Kurds were fighting Ebola, Turkey would not help the Kurds. It would side with Ebola. I mean, these are the kinds of comments that people are making online. And so if Kobanê falls, the Kurds in Turkey, who make up 20 to 24% of the population there, will start their own revolution. And we saw just a few weeks ago some major violent outbreaks in cities across the country, in 30-some provinces in the country, with deaths in Diyarbakir and other cities. So Istanbul, Izmir, Ankara, all these places across Western Turkey, and also in the southeast, the tanks rolled back in. They went back to the same practices that they had after the military coup in 1980. They reimposed curfews and whatnot. So if Kobanê falls, Ankara will take the blame as far as the Kurds in Turkey go, and they'll start stirring up what Ankara says is trouble again. Turkey is losing regional support. We've seen this manifest itself in various places. For example, just a couple of weeks ago, the UN voted in 5 new members of the Security Council. Turkey was sure that they were going to get a seat. The final round was Spain, New Zealand, and Turkey for 2 seats for Western countries. Turkey ended up losing the seat, even though the night before, the new Turkish foreign minister held a lavish party at the Waldorf Astoria to celebrate their new seat on the Security Council. So we have the future of Washington-Ankara relations, what's going to happen there. We don't know what kind of backroom deals were made that allowed Turkey to say, yes, we'll let the Pêşmerge cross overland. And then the future of Rojava. Their constitution says that they are an integral part of Syria still. But does Syria still exist? That's a question that I can't answer. Anyway, I'll stop there. And thank you. We'll open it up for questions.
We have two mics here. And
just for fun.
so please do speak into the mic, even though you think your voice will carry. We are recording this event, so please do speak in the mic.
I'll put the big map up.
I actually have
How about this one?
3 questions. The first one is a clarification. The slide said 200,000 refugees, but you said 2,000.
200,000.
It's 200,000.
200,000, yes.
That went into Turkey.
Yes.
Do you think Turkey's response to the refugees has been adequate in terms of setting up camps and providing accommodations? And also, I want to ask about the composition of the Kurdish leadership. In the media, we hear a lot about the Kurdish forces being posed as a countervalence to the ISIS, as some sort of democratic leadership. I'm wondering if the Kurdish leadership cadre is democratically elected, is it tribally based, is it based on military ties? And thirdly, I want to ask about the violence in Turkey amongst Kurdish groups. Was it by Kurds against Turkish government or between Kurdish groups, perhaps Islamic Turkish groups versus more socialist PKK, PYD Turkish groups? Thank you.
A lot of questions. In terms of refugees, I don't know how many refugees various countries have taken in, but more than 1 million in Turkey, several 100,000 in Lebanon, 700,000, 800,000 in Jordan. These countries' resources are strained to the max. I can't say if Turkey's response to taking in refugees has been adequate or not. I think all of these countries are doing a pretty good job of hosting the refugees, given the circumstances. We have more than 10 million people displaced from this civil war. 20 million, the population was 20 million, 22 million, so more than half of them have been displaced. I'll go to the violence in Turkey. I'll just touch briefly on that. Where did it come from? Who were people fighting? It was similar to what we saw in Turkey back in the 80s, where it was a lot of the religious groups and the secular groups, Kurds and some of these other, the nationalist groups. There was the police fighting against the Kurdish groups as well. Some of the deaths were similar to what we saw with other protests in Turkey and Gezi Park and whatnot. Tear gas canisters hitting people, police firing and hitting bystanders, that sort of thing. The question about the composition of the leadership, this is a very complex issue. The PYD has a strained relationship with other political parties. Many have said that the PYD has really taken over by force and that their militia, the YPG, is ruling the country in a very authoritarian manner. So how are they elected? I don't know if we have time to go into how these particular groups came into being, but suffice it to say that before this started, if we look at this, this map, the PYD mostly was confined to the northwest area, Afrin, and we had other political parties that controlled other areas. The PYD moved in very effectively, taking over. Whether the way they did it was democratic or not, I can't really say. There have been accusations and counter-accusations from all sides. part of the reason the KRG from Iraq didn't want to recognize them is because of some of these accusations. And of course, Turkey says that the PYD is part of the PKK terrorist organization. So I'll stop there.
What is the dark green on that map?
Is that the FSA?
Is that what it is?
Yeah. I don't know. I cut off the bottom part. Other questions?
Okay, any questions? Okay, there's one here.
Back during the earlier stages of the Syrian civil war, the CIA was pretty intensely involved in supporting the Free Syrian Army, and there were allegations that they were involved in that chemical attack that was being used as a pretext for bombing. I was wondering, with the current developments with ISIS, what is going on with, what is the CIA doing? Are special forces being deployed into Syria right now? What is the role of the U.S. in all of this?
Remarkable. We're in Northern California after all. Okay. One thing that does seem to be happening is that there's a good deal of covert operation taking place down along the Jordanian border. There seem to be United States Special Forces, United States elite troops, not only training Free Syrian Army units down around Jordan, but maybe doing some reconnoitering across the border. I'm not aware of any reports at all of any American activity on any of the other fronts. I'm actually on record sort of wondering what that release of chemical agents was all about outside Damascus. I mean, it's not at all clear to me what happened. We may never quite know what happened. The United States and Britain acted like the Syrian regime set off the chemical release deliberately. And maybe that happened, but there would be a bunch of other things, a bunch of other ways that chemical agents might have gotten released as well. Maybe there was some local commander that went a little bit too far. Maybe there was some blast that happened to explode some chemical ordnance that was being stored behind the lines. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that we don't quite know. Connecting that up to American operatives really does seem like a step way too far. The Syrian authorities sometimes charge that some opposition group set off the chemical weapons in order to disgrace the Syrian authorities. I mean, just think what a complicated chain of action and chain of planning that would involve. I mean, I'm not sure I think that the world is quite that complicated. You can call me naive.
So we've talked about the Kurds, we've talked about the different opposition groups. Can you talk a little bit about the impact on, I don't actually call this a civil war, I call this a bloody crackdown by a brutal dictatorship that's been in power for 43 years, which began as a peaceful protest by the people of Syria who were met by gunfire and snipers, and then members of Assad's own army began to break off because they didn't want to shoot their own people, and that was the formation of the FSA. So we haven't really heard much about the genesis of this revolution. That's my first question. My second question is, why do you think Obama, who initially said that Assad must step down, initially said that the chemical attack was a red line, and has since done basically nothing, despite warnings for the last almost 4 years that the continuing crackdown would create a vacuum that would create a scenario that we're seeing today with foreign fighters coming from all over the world and exactly what's happened? And then my third question is, how is it possible that a group that no one had even heard of, except for some Syrians, back in June, has been able to take over major towns in Iraq and major towns in Syria? Is there something going on that we are not aware of? Many people have said that ISIS was created by the Assad government to show the world that it's either him or the terrorists. Do you think there's any truth to that? Some of my Syrian friends tell me that some of the captives were actually captured by Assad forces and suddenly appeared in ISIS's hands. And there's a whole question of where they were in between. So, 3 questions.
Yeah, that third question really is the $64,000 question. I was intrigued by the map that Christopher put up that shows that giant black blot, right, showing 2/3 of Syria now under Islamic State control. That's a kind of interesting map because my sense is, A, there's a lot of wasteland out in there. It's sort of like saying that everything sort of north of Riverside would be under control if someone had the gas station halfway to Las Vegas, right? I mean, there's a lot of empty space. There's some little towns. The Islamic State is probably in charge of some of those little towns. Does that mean we should fill in a map that's completely black? I mean, that's not at all clear to me. And it does seem to me, too, that the Islamic State has been going from town to town, putting out fires, because there's been some resistance to the Islamic State, and the Islamic State guys get in the pickup trucks and go off and kill everybody when there is a little bit of an uprising, but go from town to town. There's no real garrison. There's no real administration that's been set up, except in the city of Raqqa, the big city in the middle of the country. So I think we do have to be a little bit careful about what it means to say the Islamic State controls territory. We'll have to see how that plays out a little bit. The other thing to say about this is that I certainly believe it's an open question who the fighters in the Islamic Front actually are. The wonderful Frontline documentary last night that was sort of 95% correct acted like the fighters in the Islamic Front were Iraqis who had come over from Iraq, coming out of the Al-Qaeda of Iraq organization. I haven't seen anyone else who studied that movement say that. Many people say that most of the Islamic Front fighters are young guys from all over the place. It's kind of like the French Foreign Legion. I mean, anyone who's sort of out of work and restless and so on decides to go off and join the Islamic State. And they come from Dagestan in the Caucasus, and they come from Chechnya, and they come from the Philippines, and from India, and from Britain, and all over the place to join the Islamic State. So the Islamic State is not quite a Syrian organization. It's not quite an Arab organization. There's been wonderful reporting in The Guardian that sometimes the Islamic State goes into a town, and most of the people in the Islamic State don't speak Arabic, so they can't really communicate with the local population because they've come from all over the place. So there's a lot to sort of think carefully about. Does this mean that the Islamic State has much holding power? I mean, it's a windfall that the Islamic State captured tanks and trucks and armored personnel carriers and artillery when the Islamic State moved into Mosul last May. I mean, it's quite remarkable. Suddenly, this whole American arsenal has now ended up in the hands of the Islamic State. If that had not happened, these guys would still have AK-47s and pickup trucks, and things would be a lot different. So having that huge stockpile of American weapons ready and waiting to be captured has made a huge difference.
So everybody who knows me knows I have a huge celebrity crush on Richard Engel. And he's been reporting from the Turkish side of the border because it's become so dangerous to report from Syria. So how do we even know what's happening in Syria besides Pentagon reports?
The news that I get from Syria is usually from Twitter. Friends who are in Washington, they're journalists. They have family there. They're Kurdish journalists in Washington. They know people in Kobanê or Kamishli and Amoudi, Derek, all these places, and they're on the phone. They talk to family members. They talk to the leaders of the community, or they talk to the people in the region. Talk to their counterparts in Europe, the PYD. Based in Paris, PYD based in Brussels, PYD based in wherever it might be in Europe. And so there's a lot of communication going on. You don't have to be literally there as a reporter with a microphone. They do have, actually, a lot of them have Turkish mobile phones, as that's what works there. And they're able to call out, to text, to take videos, and a lot of news is getting out. And you just have to know where to look to follow. And if you can tap into the Kurdish journalistic community in Washington in particular, and if you want afterwards I can give you some names of people, you can get a lot of information about what's going on there.
I have a question. Kristen, you talked about the 3 semi-autonomous cantons in Rojava, and you said that they declared themselves semi-autonomous at some point this past year. Could you go into a little more detail about that? Have they aligned themselves in any way with the PYD or the PKK? I know that there's a significant number of PKK troops in and around Kobanê, but do they have affiliations? And were those the reasons that the KRG was so hesitant to recognize them for so long?
These 3, it was last year that the announcement was made that they were going to declare autonomy, and it was January of this year when they did so. The first canton was Jazeera, and then the other 2 followed later that month. But it was all within a period of a couple of weeks. And the political situation there was such that it was really the PYD that reined in a lot of the chaos on the ground. And they're the ones that took over and filled these political vacuums. They're the ones who started administering the town hall, the municipality, because when the regime pulled out, all these public services stopped. And so in most places when the PYD moved in, the people saw them as those who could help the community, who could help the community continue, could restore order where they were just completely surrounded by chaos and death. But there was these 3 areas of relative tranquility. Yes, you had incursions by the regime or the FSA or offshoots of Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State or rival political parties. You had people from other Kurdish political parties who were assassinated, some say by the PYD working with the Assad regime. A lot of intrigue going on. I can't really say for sure exactly what's going on because you read one thing that says the PYD assassinated Mashal Tamo, head of a Kurdish political party. But then they say, no, it was the 3rd Brigade of the something troops of the Assad regime. So I don't know. But because of the reputation that the PYD had in terms of being so authoritarian in the way they did things, at least that was the perspective from the outside, that was part of the reason that the KRG did not want them in any of the negotiations. In fact, the KNC, the Kurdish National Council, was set up at first without the PYD, without the PKK, and no representation at all from that particular branch.
Did the parliamentary elections actually happen? I was intrigued that you said that there were elected councils. There were plans and preparations to have a parliamentary election, a body that would have govern all 3 cantons. Has that happened yet?
They're individual councils and they work together. I'm not really sure of the exact details of how they work.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I'll ask a question myself then. Fred, you mentioned that the IS people, or whatever else you want to call them, in Syria are quite disorganized, and they move into an area, take over, but then they kind of pull back and go somewhere else. However, when they were operating still in Iraq, they seemed to be quite organized. The way they kind of blanketed the area and took over Mosul in particular. It was like 2 or 3 days they were just in control of Mosul in its entirety. So that was quite organized, including oil fields. They are in control of oil fields. They're in control of, they have a lot of money flowing in from hostage negotiations and crude oil sales on the market. So they seem to be quite more organized in terms of political and financial wise. So I'm amazed.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for letting me say a few more clarifying remarks. I certainly did not mean to say that Islamic State is not organized, very well organized. My sense is that it's smaller than we think, and that it's probably more fragmented, or let's say locally autonomous units than we think. It's not clear to me that there's a headquarters for the Islamic State. The al-Baghdadi is sitting in Mosul giving sermons, but I'm not quite sure there's a military command structure. I think different units go off and do different things. Who knows? I don't know. But it strikes me that way. What I did want to say is that I think these units are quite mobile. They move around a lot. And what I was trying to say was I'm not sure that's the same thing as a well-entrenched, stable organization. I mean, there's not quite a stable administration, but it seems to be that the pickup trucks go from place to place and certainly rule by fear, rule by terror, right? Keep populations in line, but I'm not sure that there are Islamic State police on the street corner all around. One quick thing about the documentary on Frontline last night that struck me as probably too far the other direction. According to Frontline, who we trust implicitly, the force of Islamic State fighters that took over the 1.5 million population city of Mosul last May was 800 fighters. And the 800 fighters sort of rolled in, and the Iraqi army ran away, right? And so as the Iraqi army ran away, the 800 fighters just kept driving to the next intersection and the next intersection, and before long, Islamic State was, in quotation marks, in control of Mosul. Now, we ought to think about what that means. I mean, it may mean that the people of Mosul just didn't have any interest in resisting. Certainly didn't have any interest in staying part of Iraq governed from Baghdad by Prime Minister Noor al-Maliki. But are we going to count that Islamic State being in control of Mosul? I think we ought to think hard before we make that conclusion.
I just want to add something about the organization of the Islamic State. I mean, we have people coming in from 80, 85 different countries. It's a linguistic nightmare trying to organize these groups. And many of the local Islamic State units are based on language. If this group of people, they all speak Chechen, they're together in one unit. If this group is from Morocco and they only speak Moroccan Arabic, they're together. But oftentimes the lingua franca is English, sometimes very poor English. So the Islamic State has to fight using English in Syria. I'm not sure what the tweeting habits of the Islamic State fighters are. But one thing that I do want to say is that who are these people coming in from 85 different countries? They're not trained Marines. I mean, they're not, they don't have any military experience at all. They're often unemployed primary school teachers in Tunisia, or some out-of-work oil rig worker from Dagestan or something. So they arrive in country, they don't speak the language, and they have no military experience. So this really slows down, thank God, what ISIS is doing at times, because they have all these warm bodies, but with no potential. And so many of the units there are forced then to train them and then figure out how to put them together into these fighting units, these very haphazard units. Okay, here's a pickup truck with, I don't even know what they're called. That type of machine gun that's mounted on the back. Go to that town and take over the intersection, that sort of thing.
I agree with that with a couple of quick caveats. Okay. One quick caveat is that some of these Islamic State fighters do have military experience. They are Chechens that fought hard against the Russian armed forces in Chechnya in the late 1990s. So they do have battlefield experience, or they are fighters who have fought in other parts of the Caucasus, in Dagestan or something. Now I forget what was the second thing I was going to say. But in principle, I think you're quite right that, and the other group of well-trained fighters that's part of the Islamic State are the former Iraqi army officers that were thrown out by the Provisional Coalition Authority in 2003. So there are some well-trained people, but I think the linguistic problem and the coordination problem really has kept the Islamic State much more limited than it might have been.
And I want to add something else, not about outside forces that are joining the Islamic State, but who are the outside forces that are joining the Kurds? And there was a very interesting story about a motorcycle gang from the Netherlands. I don't know if you read about that. This Dutch biker gang decided that they were going to take up arms and go fight.
Enough is enough.
Enough is enough, and they jumped on their Harleys and drove across Europe to fight with the Kurds. So it's not just the Islamic State that gets international fighters. The Kurds do too. So I just wanted to mention that.
No, there's one more.
Hi. So she mentioned the black market of oil, and the Islamic State is getting a lot of their funding. A lot of their funding from the black market, the oil black market. Who, if you can say who, is purchasing this oil?
You, me, us. The global oil market really is this big pot. And once the stuff gets dumped into it, it gets distributed all over the place. But the distribution, I think, really is tricky, and I haven't kept up the way that I should. But the Turkish authorities have been turning a blind eye. So stuff gets loaded into a truck, gets driven up to the border or across the border, and then across Turkey, down to Ceyhan, and then dumped into a giant vat with legitimate oil from all over the place, I think.
Well, I've heard about the smuggling across the Turkish border. Certainly, that's part of it. I've also heard that the Islamic State is selling it to the Assad regime through Christian intermediaries. There are different groups that have taken it upon themselves to facilitate those transactions. But again, I mean, how do you find out this information when you don't have people on the ground? Some of it is speculation. Some of it has been reported by people on the ground. Perhaps you have your hand up. Do you have more information? Oh, okay.
May I say really quickly, until just recently, there was very good reporting in the British newspaper The Guardian. And The Guardian correspondent Ghaith Abu Ahed did wonderful reporting from northeastern Syria, northern Iraq. But those territories have gotten so dangerous now that I don't even think the most adventurous reporter would be going in now. But keep up with The Guardian website.
I am wondering about the near future of Islamic State. It seems Islamic State is not only a threat for, Kurds and other minorities in Syria, in Iraq, perhaps for whole Middle East, but it is a threat for whole world. Regardless of that, it seems the whole world is watching what is going on, as if it is a video game or if it is a war movie. Everybody is watching, but this is a war. This is real. It is happening right now. So I am wondering what insight you have. Anybody can answer. What insight you have about what United States and the international coalition forces are going to do about Islamic State? I know dynamics are so changing and diplomacy is changing based on that. It is hard to guess, but just some insight. Thank you.
It seems to me that the Russians and the Iranians agree with you 100%. The Russians are really, really worried about the Islamic State, partly because there are so many Caucasus fighters involved, and the Russians are worried that at some point those guys will all go back to the Caucasus, and the Russian armed forces will have to take them on. The Iranians are dead worried about this, because the Iranians feel like the next target for these various militant Sunni radicals will be the Islamic Republic. And the Iranians are already facing an upsurge of Sunni violence down in the corner, down near Pakistan and Baluchistan already. So the Iranians and the Russians are quite exercised about this. They've got their laser focused on it. And it's striking to me that Washington is making no effort to form any kind of collaborative global coalition with Moscow and Tehran. I mean, one would think that the global coalition should absolutely include those two, and let's let Russia take a leading role. The Russians might well do it, but I'm stunned by this, that the United States completely leaves Iran out, leaves Russia out of this planning.
I'll give you a perspective that I had from this summer. I spent the summer in Jordan, and I was there for 2 months with 19 students from across the U.S. on a study abroad program. And it was very interesting seeing the region through their eyes, because they hadn't traveled out of the U.S. before. Some of them hadn't left their home state before, hadn't even been on an airplane before. So the conversations we had were often very enlightening, because they could see things that I couldn't, because I was often overthinking the situation. And they pointed out to me that they said Washington is doing quite a bit to help Jordan, and which is true. Jordan is one of the key allies for the U.S. And they very aptly pointed out that one of Kerry's comments led them to believe that really the only reason they're actually helping Jordan is to ensure that the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan is a buffer state so that the Islamic State cannot get to Israel. As a foreign policy point there, the way they were thinking, the way that they heard the comments, that's how they interpret it. So I was able to maybe look at things a little differently than normal. And I think some of the Jordanians, too, saw Washington's motives as not particularly helpful for them, but rather for others in the region. So that was just the perspective from the South. I think there was a question here?
There's one over there. And then, so you had said that some of the fighters in the Islamic State...
Can you put that microphone closer?
Yeah. You said some of the fighters in the Islamic State are the former Saddam people. And all of the media coverage of Islamic State is that there are these extreme radical Islamists and, you know, cutting off heads and doing things in the name of Islam. How do the two mesh? Is my first question. And my second question is, you know, if I'm coming from Chechnya or Afghanistan and I want to save, you know, Syrian women who are being killed by Iranian militia or Hezbollah or Alawis, you know, why would I not question the fact that I'm suddenly fighting and killing Sunni Kurds and not fighting Assad? From what I've read, they have never really fought Assad. They're fighting everybody else. Why would people go along with that?
Why would what people go along with it?
I mean, if you're going to risk your life and travel halfway across the world to go defend oppressed Syrian Sunnis who are being killed by Alawis and Shias and a host of other groups, the Russians, Iranians, Hezbollah, working to help Assad, but then you find yourself killing Kurds who are Sunnis, wouldn't you ask yourself, what's going on here? Why are we not fighting Assad instead of all these other people? And the other question was, you know, if you're in a coalition with Saddam's people.
I want to do the exercise of trying to put myself in the shoes of an Islamic State person, but I could imagine someone sort of goes off, I don't know, idealistic, challenged, bloodthirsty sort of gang person who decides to go off and learn how to shoot an AK-47 and doing it for a good cause, and one shows up. And the Kurdistan regional government has pretty good ties to the USA, right? I mean, there's an American university in Kurdistan. I mean, it's not a tremendous leap to think that the Kurds might be somehow hand in glove with the West, whether they're Sunnis or not. Are they good Sunnis? Are they real Sunnis? But now I have made the slip, because the second thing I wanted to say is I think it's a huge mistake to think that the Islamic State has anything Islam going on with it. I mean, Islam. But this is why the Obama administration doesn't even use the term Islamic State, but still keeps calling it the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, right? I mean, they don't want to claim, nobody official wants to give official stamp that these guys are doing anything like what the religion would say people should behave. So we always need to catch ourselves, I think, and say that this is not what the religion prescribes, what 98% of Muslims would say the religion prescribes.
Yes, a question about the role of the United Nations. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has condemned many of these actions, and there have been the efforts to remove the chemical warfare weapons and so on, and yet no agreement in the Security Council with Russia, China, the United States, UK, France, and so forth. Do you see any way to break this stalemate? And also, do you see any way to control the money that's flowing in from outside for weapons?
My understanding was that the chemical weapons had been removed, mostly, or
there are reports that some of the components were held back. There are reports that some kinds of weapons were in fact taken aboard the U.S. ship, and others were not. So we don't know, I think.
And in terms of the closing the border, I mean, Syria has borders with 6, 7 countries. What was it, 1, 2? Anyway, I think the most porous of those borders is the one with Turkey. And I think Turkey needs to be doing a lot more to keep that border closed, because there's a lot of back and forth. We hear reports of 6 Islamic State fighters who are wounded, and all of a sudden there's a video showing a truck crossing the border heading to a local hospital in Turkey to treat them. So it goes both ways. There's flow of money and arms and people back and forth. That border is very porous.
It's an intriguing comment. It's an intriguing comment because I don't envy American policymakers or German policymakers trying to wrestle with this. There's a good deal of pressure from the Syrian National Coalition. There's a good deal of pressure in the United States Senate to send more weapons into this region, that the solution is not to limit weapons, but in fact to arm all kinds of relatively obscure other groups. So how are we going to balance that out?
Yeah. I don't. Yeah.
Can you comment a little on the elephant in the room, the Saudis, as to their role in this whole thing?
Yeah, maybe, but not. Probably not satisfactorily. One thing to say is that for the first couple of years of the Syrian civil war, the major outside actor was the Qatari government and rich individuals, rich business people in the Gulf. And Qatar was setting the agenda. Qatar was financing armed groups and so on. But at some point, a year and a half ago, the Saudis started to shoulder in. The Saudis started to displace Qatari money, displace Qatari patronage, and so the Saudis are by now by far the largest outside government, largest outside force. The Syrian National Coalition seems to be pretty bound up with Saudi interests in important ways. The Saudis, however, have discovered that the genie is simply out of the bottle, right? Because the Islamic State guys would just as soon shoot up the Saudi ruling family as anything, right? So the Saudi government is desperate to somehow put a limit on the Islamic State, to somehow roll this all back, just like Washington is and just like Moscow is. So the Saudis have really kind of constructed a situation that now is very dangerous for Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis are quite worried that that some of the fighters in the Islamic State, if they get thrown out of Syria, will end up in the southern part of Saudi Arabia and carry on the armed struggle against not true Muslims. But this time the not true Muslims will be the Saudi elite.
So I think we have time for one, hopefully quick question, and then we can thank our speakers for...
I think this guy has the microphone. Yeah.
Oh, okay, so that's it.
Okay. With the sectarian, like the ethno-sectarian character you described that the conflict's taken on, and with the government in Syria or in Damascus being led by Bashar al-Assad and kind of like a protectorate almost of the Alawites. I mean, what do you see, like, where do you see the place of the Alawites in the future of Syria?
What a very good question. A couple of quick things to say. One thing to say is that prior to the year 2000, when Hafez al-Assad was president of Syria, the Syrian government and the Syrian elite took good care of poor Alawis out in the countryside and built schools and hospitals and make sure there were places in the armed forces and so on. But after Bashar al-Assad becomes president, that patronage connection starts to dry up, and poorer Alawis out there in the northwest begin to feel like they're being exploited like everybody else. It's not clear that the poor Alawis are firm, permanent support, eternal supporters of President Bashar al-Assad. The Alawis have sort of been pushed in that direction because there's no real alternative. There was a tremendous story, where did I read it? I think it was in the Lebanese newspaper, Al-Akhbar, yesterday or day before, about Alawis in Syria kind of grumbling that they're bearing the brunt. They are suffering as a result of the sins of the Assad regime, and Alawis are starting to resist being drafted and sort of staying away when the army recruiters come through town and so on. So I think there's a potential for the Alawi community to put arm's length with the existing regime, and that would throw one more actor, one more party into the conflict. But the Alawis are really stuck now because they're probably going to be punished for the sins of the regime if Kurds or Sunni militants or someone else becomes predominant.
All right, well, I would like to thank both Fred Lawson and Christian Sinclair for their wonderful presentations. And thank you all for being here and asking such interesting questions. Thank you all. Thank you.